Darren's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to stay awake. His body ached, his head throbbed, and the freezing air bit into his skin like tiny needles. His escape pod had crashed onto this unknown planet just minutes ago, and already he felt the cruel touch of death creeping closer. He forced himself to sit up, blinking against the swirling snow that surrounded him. His helmet's visor was cracked, and his suit's thermal regulator was failing. A red warning flashed on his wrist display. Temp or HUR critical. Survival time. 10 minutes. He groaned. 10 minutes. That's all. His ship had been attacked in deep space. He never saw the enemy, only heard the alarms and felt the violent tremors before everything went dark. The emergency system ejected him in a pod, but something had gone wrong. Instead of landing safely, he had plummeted through the planet's thick clouds and crashed hard against the frozen ground. Now he was alone. Darren pushed himself to his feet, his boots sinking into the thick snow. A storm howled around him, drowning out all sound except for the roaring wind. He turned, searching for anything, shelter, debris, a sign of life, but saw only an endless white wasteland. He tapped at his wrist display, hoping to get a reading on his surroundings. Atmosphere, thin oxygen, extreme cold, unknown planet. The screen flickered, then went black. His suit was shutting down. His heartbeat quickened. If he didn't find warmth soon, he would freeze. Darren stumbled forward, his legs heavy like lead. His breath formed ice on the inside of his broken visor. Every step was harder than the last. He tried to stay focused, but his vision blurred. His body was losing the fight. Keep moving. He forced himself forward, but the storm was growing stronger. The wind pushed against him, and the snow made it impossible to see. His knees buckled, and he crashed face first into the icy ground. No, not like this. Darren tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave out. His eyelids felt heavy. If he just rested for a moment, just a moment. Darkness crept at the edges of his vision. Then, footsteps. A shadow moved through the storm, tall and covered in thick fur. A pair of glowing blue eyes locked onto him. The figure knelt beside him, and a hand, large, clawed, but gentle, touched his shoulder. A deep, unfamiliar voice spoke, but Darren couldn't understand the words. He wanted to speak, to ask for help, but his lips wouldn't move. The world was slipping away. The last thing he felt was strong arms lifting him from the snow. Then, everything went dark. Darren awoke to warmth. It was the first thing he noticed. His body no longer ached from the freezing wind. His fingers, which had gone numb in the storm, tingled as heat returned to them. His breathing felt easier, no longer sharp and painful from the cold air. Slowly, he opened his eyes. A soft orange glow flickered on the rough stone walls around him. The air smelled of burning wood and something earthy, like dried herbs. He was lying on a thick fur blanket, his suit still on but missing his helmet. His skin felt stiff, as if it had just barely escaped frostbite. Darren turned his head and froze. A figure sat nearby, watching him. She was tall, with long, thick fur covering her body, a mix of white and silver, blending with the icy world outside. Her features were sharp but not human. Her eyes glowed a deep blue, and her ears were long and pointed. Clawed hands rested on her lap, and a long furred tail curled beside her. She did not move, only observed him with silent curiosity. Darren's heart pounded. An alien. He swallowed hard. What was this place? Was he a prisoner? Would she harm him? The alien woman tilted her head slightly. Then she spoke, her voice deep yet smooth, a language unknown to him. Darren blinked, shaking his head. I don't understand. His throat was dry, his voice weak. The woman frowned, then reached to the side and picked up a small clay bowl. She held it out to him. Darren hesitated. Was it food, water, or something else? His body ached for nourishment, but he had no idea if it was safe. The woman seemed to sense his hesitation. To show it wasn't poisoned, she brought the bowl to her lips, took a small sip, then held it out again. Darren hesitated no longer. He took the bowl in his shaking hands and brought it to his lips. Warm, thick liquid slid down his throat. A broth, rich and slightly bitter, but comforting. Relief flooded him. He was alive. And more importantly, he wasn't alone. The woman watched him silently as he finished drinking. When he was done, she took the bowl back and placed it beside her. Darren sat up carefully, feeling the weight of exhaustion still in his limbs. He looked around. The shelter was a cave, but not a natural one. There were furs and wooden tools, even a small fire pit with smooth stones arranged neatly. This was someone's home, her home. The alien woman studied him with careful eyes. After a moment, she pointed at herself and said, "Rinna." Darren blinked. Was that her name? She repeated, slower, "Rinna." Understanding clicked in his mind. She was introducing herself. He pressed a hand to his chest and said, "Darren." Rinna narrowed her eyes, then repeated, "Darren." It sounded strange from her lips, but it was close enough. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The fire crackled between them, casting shadows on the cave walls. Darren had 1,000 questions. Where was he? What was this planet? Were there more like her? Would she let him stay? But for now, none of that mattered. She had saved his life. And for the first time since he crashed on this frozen world, he felt a spark of hope. Darren sat by the fire, feeling its warmth seep into his frozen bones. His body was weak, but the hot broth and shelter had given him enough strength to stay awake. His mind, however, was still spinning. Rinna, the alien woman who had saved him, sat across from him, watching silently. Her glowing blue eyes reflected the flickering firelight, unreadable and calm. Darren glanced at his wrist display, but the screen remained dark. His suit had lost power, leaving him with no way to contact anyone, if there was even anyone out there. He sighed and leaned back against the rough stone wall. He was stranded, but at least he wasn't dead. Rinna stood suddenly, her long fur cloak shifting as she moved. She walked to the entrance of the cave, pushing aside a thick hide that served as a door. A gust of icy wind rushed in, and Darren shivered. Outside, the storm had calmed, but the world was still a vast, white wasteland. The ground was covered in thick snow, the sky a dull gray. Strange ice formations jutted from the land like frozen spikes. Rinna turned to him and motioned with her hand. She wanted him to follow. Darren hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to step back into the cold, but he needed to understand where he was. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs were weak, but he managed to stand. Rinna nodded in approval and stepped outside. Darren took a deep breath and followed. The moment he stepped out, the cold hit him like a punch. Even with his suit's insulation, the freezing air bit at his exposed skin. He pulled his torn jacket tighter around himself. Rinna didn't seem to notice the cold at all. She stood on a high ridge, looking over the land. Darren moved beside her and followed her gaze. The planet was endless ice. Snow-covered mountains loomed in the distance, and frozen rivers snaked across the land. Strange, towering structures of ice and rock stood far away, shaked by the wind. No cities, no ships, no signs of civilization. Darren's heart sank. I really am alone here. Rinna pointed at the horizon and spoke in her language. Darren frowned, trying to understand. She gestured to the land, then pointed to herself, then to him. Darren nodded slowly. You're showing me your world. Rinna tilted her head, then nodded back, as if she understood his meaning. Darren sighed. At least she's trying to communicate. They stood there for a while, the wind howling around them. Then Rinna turned and motioned for him to follow again. She led him down the ridge, her steps light and sure. Darren struggled to keep up, his boots sinking into the deep snow. After a short walk, they reached a frozen lake. The ice was smooth and clear, reflecting the gray sky above. Strange, glowing fish swam beneath the surface, their blue and green lights flickering in the dark water. Darren stared, amazed. Even in this frozen wasteland, life existed. Rena knelt by the lake and reached into a pouch at her side. She pulled out a small, sharp tool and pressed it against the ice. With precise movements, she cut a small hole. Then she reached into the water and pulled out a glowing fish with her bare hands. Darren's eyes widened. How are you not freezing?" Rena looked at him, then at her fur-covered arms, as if confused by his question. She shrugged and held out the fish. Darren took a step back. "You want me to eat that?" She nodded. Darren hesitated, then sighed. "Better than starving." Rena pulled out a small knife and quickly cleaned the fish, removing its glowing parts. Then she wrapped the meat in leaves and handed it to him. Darren took it, unsure. He glanced at her, then at the fish, then back at her. "All right, here goes nothing." He took a bite. The meat was soft and slightly salty, but surprisingly good. Warmth spread through his body, chasing away some of the cold. Rena watched him closely, then gave a small nod of approval. For the first time since he had crashed, Darren felt something strange. He wasn't just surviving. He was learning to live in this new world. And he wasn't alone. Darren sat near the fire, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The cave was quiet except for the soft crackling of burning wood. His body still ached, but the glowing fish he had eaten earlier had given him strength. Across from him, Rena was carefully sharpening a long bone knife. Her furred hands moved with practiced skill, her glowing blue eyes focused. She had barely spoken to him since they returned from the frozen lake. Darren sighed. "How do I talk to her?" She had saved his life, given him food and shelter, yet they were still strangers. They didn't speak the same language, but he needed to find a way to communicate. He tapped his chest. "Darren." Rena paused, looking up. He repeated, slower, "Darren." She nodded slightly, then tapped her own chest. "Rena." Darren smiled. "A small step, but it's something." He looked around the cave, searching for a way to continue. His eyes landed on the fire. He pointed at it. "Fire." Rena tilted her head, then repeated in her own language, "Zarin." Darren frowned. "Zarin. Fire." He pointed again. Rena seemed to understand. She nodded and pointed at the fire. "Zarin." A spark of excitement ran through Darren. He pointed at himself. "Human." Then at her. "Valeri?" Rena hesitated, then gave a short nod. "So that's what her people are called. Valeri." Darren sat back, satisfied. It wasn't much, but at least now he had something to work with. Suddenly, Rena stood up. She grabbed a long spear resting against the wall and slung a small satchel over her shoulder. Darren raised an eyebrow. "Going somewhere?" She pointed toward the cave entrance, then mimicked drawing a bow and releasing an arrow. Darren nodded. "Hunting." She gave a sharp nod in return and moved toward the exit. Darren hesitated. He didn't want to sit around doing nothing. Maybe he could help. He pointed to himself, then mimicked holding a spear. "I go." Rena studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Without a word, she tossed him a smaller spear made of sharpened bone. Darren barely caught it. He stared at the weapon, then at her. "Oh, you were serious." She smirked, a small expression, but it was the first sign of amusement he had seen from her. Taking that as approval, Darren followed her into the cold. The two of them moved through the icy wilderness, their feet crunching against the snow. The wind was calmer today, but the air was still bitterly cold. Rena moved like a shadow, her steps light and careful. Darren, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. His boots sank into the deep snow with every step. After a short while, Rena stopped and motioned for him to crouch. She pointed ahead. Darren followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. A massive creature stood in the snow-covered valley below. It resembled a bear but was twice the size, covered in thick white fur with curved horns on its head. Its deep growls rumbled through the air as it dug into the ice, searching for food. Darren's grip tightened on his spear. "That thing is huge." Rena whispered something in her language, then pointed at him and mimicked stay. Darren nodded. He wasn't about to argue. Rena moved with incredible speed, circling the beast with practiced steps. She readied her spear, muscles tense. Then, with deadly precision, she hurled it. The spear struck the creature's side, and it let out a furious roar. Darren's heart pounded. The beast turned toward Rena, its massive claws digging into the snow. Rena didn't hesitate. She pulled out her bone knife and sprinted toward it, dodging as it swiped at her. Darren watched in shock. She's fast. But then, the beast roared and charged. Rena leaped back, but her foot slipped on the ice. She fell, her knife sliding away. Darren's breath caught. She was defenseless. His instincts kicked in. He tightened his grip on the spear and ran. The beast loomed over Rena, ready to strike. Darren let out a shout and threw his spear with all his strength. The weapon struck deep into the creature's neck. It let out a gurgled snarl, staggering. Rena didn't waste the chance. She rolled to the side, grabbed her fallen knife, and plunged it into the beast's throat. A final breath escaped the creature before it collapsed into the snow. Silence filled the air. Darren panted, his heart racing. He looked at Rena, expecting her to be angry that he interfered. Instead, she studied him carefully. Then, to his surprise, she gave a small nod of approval. Darren let out a shaky breath. He had just helped take down a monster twice his size. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance of surviving this world after all. The beast lay still in the snow, steam rising from its warm body into the freezing air. Darren's hands trembled slightly, both from the cold and the rush of adrenaline. He had never hunted before, not like this. Rena stepped forward and pulled her knife from the creature's throat. She wiped the blade on its thick fur before turning to Darren. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Rena gave a small nod. Approval. Darren let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rena knelt beside the beast and pulled out a curved tool made from bone. She gestured for Darren to come closer. He hesitated but then moved beside her. She pointed at the beast's thick fur, then at him. Warm. Darren blinked, then realized what she meant. His suit was tough, but it wasn't designed for this kind of cold. His hands and face still burned from the freezing air. She was offering him a way to survive. Darren nodded. All right. I get it. Rena smirked slightly and began working. She moved with practiced skill, cutting through the thick hide. Darren watched closely, then hesitantly picked up a blade she had set aside and copied her movements. At first, he struggled. The hide was tough, and his hands weren't used to this kind of work. But Rena didn't laugh at him or push him aside. Instead, she showed him the right way, where to cut, how to pull the skin free without wasting anything. It was slow work, but eventually, they had what they needed. Rena wrapped some of the meat in thick leaves and placed it in her satchel. Then, she handed Darren a large piece of fur. He held it up, feeling its warmth even through his gloves. This will help. Rena simply nodded. As they stood, the wind picked up again, howling through the valley. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, signaling another storm. Rena pointed back toward the cave. Home. Darren didn't need a translation. He slung the fur over his shoulders and followed her through the snow. By the time they returned to the cave, the storm had begun. Wind and snow pounded against the entrance, but inside, the fire still burned, filling the space with warmth. Darren collapsed onto the thick furs, exhaustion weighing him down. His muscles ached from the hunt, but there was a deep satisfaction in his chest. He had helped. He had fought. And now he had something real, something to protect himself against the cold. Rena sat across from him, tending to the meat. She placed a few pieces near the fire, letting the heat dry them out. The rest she set aside, wrapped tightly in leaves. Darren watched her work. She moved with quiet efficiency, every action precise and purposeful. It was clear she had done this many times before. After a moment, she glanced at him. Darren, fight. Darren raised an eyebrow. Fight. She nodded. Then, to his surprise, she mimicked throwing a spear, just as he had done earlier. Darren chuckled. You mean, I fight well. Rena tilted her head, thinking, then nodded. Darren smirked. Well, I had to do something. That thing was about to crush you. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him carefully, as if seeing him differently now. Then she tapped her chest. Valari, hunt, strong. Darren pointed to himself. Human, not strong. Rena's eyes narrowed. She shook her head. No, she pointed at him. Strong. Darren blinked. She wasn't just talking about physical strength. For the first time, he realized that maybe in her eyes, he wasn't just some weak outsider. Maybe, just maybe, she saw him as something more. Someone who could survive here. Someone who could fight. A small smile tugged at his lips. Thanks. Rena didn't reply, but she didn't need to. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, Darren felt something new. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning. And for the first time, he truly believed. He might just have a future on this frozen world. The storm outside roared like a living beast, shaking the cave walls with its fury. The wind howled through the cracks, but the fire inside burned steadily, casting a warm glow over the stone walls. Darren sat near the fire, wrapped in the thick fur Rena had given him. The warmth seeped into his skin, chasing away the last traces of the bitter cold. He had never worn anything like it before, but now, he understood why Rena and her people relied on these furs. His damaged suit wouldn't keep him alive forever. He needed to adapt. Rena sat across from him, sharpening her bone knife with slow, practiced movements. She hadn't spoken much since they returned from the hunt, but her actions spoke for her. She had accepted him, not just as a lost outsider, but as someone who could learn. Darren watched her for a moment, then picked up a bone shard from the pile of remains left over from their kill. He studied it, running his fingers along its rough edge. If he was going to survive, he needed more than just a spear. He needed tools. He glanced at Rena, then pointed at the knife she was sharpening. How do you make that? Rena looked up, her glowing blue eyes studying him. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, she reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a sharp-edged stone. She held it up and said, Tarak. Darren nodded. Tarak. She tapped the bone in his hand and motioned for him to follow her lead. Then, she demonstrated, striking the stone against the bone, chipping away at the edges until it formed a sharp point. Darren copied her movements, but his strikes were clumsy. The bone splintered in the wrong places, leaving uneven edges. He frowned. This is harder than it looks. Rena smirked slightly. Try again. Darren exhaled and adjusted his grip. He struck the bone carefully, trying to mimic her technique. After several tries, he finally managed to carve a rough, jagged edge. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Rena examined his work, then nodded approvingly. Good. Darren felt a small sense of pride. I'm actually learning. But there was still so much more he needed to understand. He pointed at her spear. Teach me more. Rena raised an eyebrow, then stood. She picked up her spear and motioned for him to follow. Darren got to his feet, stretching his sore muscles. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cave, there was enough space for movement. Rena planted her feet firmly, holding the spear in both hands. She pointed at him. "Watch." Then, with precise movements, she demonstrated a series of strikes. Quick jabs, powerful thrusts, and swift dodges. Her body moved like a predator, fluid, controlled, and deadly. Darren swallowed. "She's fast. Really fast." Rena finished her demonstration and looked at him expectantly. Darren hesitated, then copied her stance. He held the spear tightly, feeling its weight in his hands. He tried to mimic her movements, but his strikes were too slow, his footing too unstable. The spear wobbled in his grip. Rena sighed. She stepped behind him and reached out, adjusting his posture. She pushed his feet apart, straightened his back, and tightened his grip on the spear. Then she stepped back. Again. Darren exhaled and tried again. This time, his strikes were steadier. His movements felt more natural. He wasn't perfect, but he was improving. Rena nodded. "Better." Darren grinned. "Not bad for a beginner." "Right." She smirked. "Not bad." They continued for a while, practicing the basics of combat. Darren's muscles burned, but he pushed through the exhaustion. He wasn't just training. He was preparing for whatever dangers this world had in store. Finally, Rena stepped back. Enough. Darren let out a breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. His body ached, but he felt stronger than before. As they sat back near the fire, he looked at her and asked, "Why help me?" Rena was quiet for a moment. Then she tapped her chest. "Valerie, survive. Always." She pointed at him. "You survive." Darren understood. She wasn't just training him for fun. She was preparing him to survive in this harsh world. He nodded. "I won't die easily." Rena smirked. "Good." Outside, the storm howled, but inside the cave, Darren felt something new. Hope. He wasn't just a lost human anymore. He was becoming something more. And for the first time, he truly believed he would survive. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world covered in fresh snow. The sky was a pale blue, the sun casting a weak glow over the icy landscape. Darren stepped outside the cave, wrapped in the thick fur he and Rena had taken from the beast they hunted. The air was cold, but he could bear it now. He was getting stronger. Rena stood nearby, her spear in hand, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. She had been restless since dawn. Darren could tell something was bothering her. He walked up beside her. "What's wrong?" Rena didn't answer right away. She pointed at the snow. Darren followed her gaze and saw them. Footprints. They were large, deep, and not from any animal he had seen before. The tracks led from the east, stopping a short distance from the cave before turning back. Someone, or something, had been watching them. Darren felt a chill run down his spine. That's not good. Rena's grip tightened on her spear. "Not animal." Darren nodded. "People." She gave a short, sharp nod. "Raiders." Darren frowned. He had heard that word before in old stories. People who stole, who killed to survive. He swallowed. "They're dangerous." Rena turned to him, her glowing blue eyes serious. "Yes." Darren clenched his fists. He had barely started to learn how to survive here. And now there were threats beyond the cold and the wild beasts. "Will they come back?" he asked. Rena looked at the tracks again, her expression unreadable. "Maybe." That was not the answer he wanted to hear. They returned to the cave quickly. Rena began gathering supplies, extra weapons, dried food, and thick furs. Darren helped without question. If there was even a chance of danger, he wasn't going to sit and do nothing. He picked up his spear, running his fingers over the sharpened bone tip. Just days ago, he wouldn't have known how to use it. Now he felt a strange sense of confidence. He wasn't an expert, but he wasn't completely helpless anymore. Rena glanced at him. "You fight." Darren smirked. "If I have to." She studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. They didn't speak much after that. The tension was thick in the air. Then, as the sun began to set, Rena suddenly held up a hand. "Listen." Darren froze, straining his ears. At first, he heard nothing but the wind. But then, there it was. Crunch. The sound of footsteps on snow. Someone was out there. Rena moved silently, pressing herself against the cave wall. She motioned for Darren to stay back. He obeyed, gripping his spear tightly. The footsteps grew closer. Shadows moved beyond the cave entrance. Then, a figure stepped into view. It was tall and covered in thick armor made from bones and leather. Its face was hidden behind a mask of carved ice. It held a crude spear, its tip made of sharpened metal. Darren's heart pounded. This was no wild animal. This was a raider. The figure took a step forward, peering into the cave. Then Rena moved. She struck like a predator, her spear flashing through the air. The raider barely had time to react before her weapon slammed into his chest, knocking him backward into the snow. The raider let out a sharp cry, struggling to rise. But Rena was faster. She pressed her spear against his throat, her eyes burning with warning. Darren rushed forward, holding his own weapon, unsure if he should attack. The raider's breathing was heavy. His hands twitched toward his belt, where a jagged knife was strapped. Rena growled something in her language, a warning. The raider froze. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind howling around them. Then, the raider slowly raised his hands in surrender. Darren let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rena didn't lower her spear. "More," she demanded. The raider hesitated, then shook his head. "No, alone," he rasped in a rough, unfamiliar accent. Darren narrowed his eyes. Was he telling the truth? Rena seemed to consider this. Then, with a sharp motion, she pulled her spear away. The raider scrambled to his feet, clutching his chest where she had struck him. He took one last look at them before turning and disappearing into the snow. Darren exhaled. That was intense. Rena didn't respond immediately. She stared after the raider, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Darren. "More will come." Darren tightened his grip on his spear. "Then we get ready." Rena nodded, and for the first time, he saw something new in her eyes. Not just respect, trust. They were no longer just two survivors. They were allies. And together, they would fight. The night was silent, but Darren knew that silence could be dangerous. He and Rena sat near the entrance of the cave, weapons in hand, waiting. The fire inside was dimmed to keep them hidden. The raider had left, but his words still echoed in Darren's mind. More will come. Rena was sharpening her spear, her expression cold and unreadable. Darren glanced at her. Do you think he was lying? She shook her head. Raiders never alone. Darren sighed. That's what I was afraid of. He checked his own spear, running his fingers along the sharpened tip. His heart pounded in his chest. A few days ago, he was just struggling to survive the cold. Now he was preparing for a fight. I won't run. I won't be weak. Rena suddenly held up a hand. Listen. Darren froze. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Many footsteps. The snow outside crunched as multiple figures approached. Shadows flickered against the white landscape, moving closer to the cave. Darren gripped his spear tightly. How many? Rena peeked outside and whispered, 5. Darren swallowed hard. 5 was a lot. More than just one raider. More than just a simple scouting party. This was an attack. Rena looked at him. We fight. Darren nodded. There was no running now. Rena's eyes burned with determination. Then we fight. The first raider stepped into the cave entrance, his weapon raised. His eyes barely had time to widen before Rena struck. Her spear shot forward, slamming into his shoulder. The raider grunted in pain, stumbling back. Darren didn't wait. He lunged forward, swinging his spear at another attacker. The raider dodged, but Darren managed to knock him off balance. The cave erupted into chaos. One of the raiders charged at Rena with a jagged knife. She twisted aside, moving like a shadow, and slammed the butt of her spear into his ribs. The raider gasped and fell to the ground. Darren barely had time to react as another enemy rushed him. He raised his weapon just in time, blocking a wild swing. The impact sent a shock through his arms, but he held firm. His attacker snarled and kicked him backward. Darren hit the ground hard. The air knocked from his lungs. The raider loomed over him, raising his weapon for a killing blow. But before the strike could land, Rena was there. She moved fast, her spear slashing through the air. The raider barely had time to react before she struck, forcing him away from Darren. Darren coughed, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed his spear again, gripping it tighter. He couldn't let Rena do all the work. Another raider lunged at him. This time, Darren was ready. He sidestepped, then drove his spear forward. The sharp tip pierced through the raider's arm, forcing him to retreat with a cry of pain. Darren didn't stop. He pressed forward, swinging again and again. He wasn't the best fighter, but he had speed, determination, and the will to survive. Beside him, Rena fought like a storm. She moved with deadly precision, her every strike landing with force. One by one, the raiders began to falter. Finally, the last two raiders hesitated. They exchanged glances, then ran. Darren breathed heavily, watching them disappear into the night. The battle was over. For now, Darren leaned against the cave wall, his arms shaking from exhaustion. We did it. Rena nodded, wiping her blade. Yes. Darren looked down at his hands, still gripping his weapon. He had fought. He had survived. He turned to Rena. What now? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They will return. With more." Darren exhaled. He had known the fight wasn't over, but he wasn't afraid. He met Rena's gaze and nodded. "Then we get ready." She smirked. They had won this battle. But the real fight was still coming. The night was long, but Darren and Rena did not sleep. The raiders had fled, but they would return. Stronger, more prepared. Darren knew it. Rena knew it. So they worked. They reinforced the cave entrance with thick branches and sharpened bones. They set up traps, hidden spikes under the snow, loose rocks ready to fall. Darren's hands were sore, his body aching. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Rena handed him a piece of dried meat. "Eat." He took it without argument, chewing slowly. The food gave him strength, but his mind was still heavy. "What if there are too many?" he asked. Rena glanced at him, then at the horizon. The sky was dark, but in the distance, a faint glow flickered. "Fire." "They come," she said simply. Darren swallowed. "Then we fight." Rena nodded. There was nothing else to say. The first sign of attack came just before dawn. Darren heard the crunch of snow. Then, a whistle. An arrow shot past his head, striking the cave wall. He ducked, heart pounding. They were here. Rena grabbed her spear and crouched low. "Wait." Darren held his breath. Footsteps grew closer. Shadows moved against the snow. The raiders thought they had the advantage. They were wrong. The first raider stepped over the hidden spikes. Rena yanked a rope. Snap! The ground collapsed beneath the raider, sending him crashing into the trap below. He screamed as sharpened bones pierced through his armor. The others hesitated. That was their mistake. Darren lunged forward, thrusting his spear at the nearest enemy. The raider blocked, but Darren had learned. He twisted his weapon, sweeping the raider's legs out from under him. Rena moved like a shadow, striking with deadly precision. Her spear found its mark again and again, forcing the raiders back. But there were too many. Darren barely had time to block another strike before something hit him hard. He crashed into the snow, gasping for breath. A raider loomed over him, raising a crude axe. Darren rolled aside just as the blade smashed into the ground. He scrambled up, gripping his spear tighter. I can't lose. I won't lose. The raider charged again. Darren dodged, then struck, a sharp thrust straight to the gut. The raider fell, groaning in pain. Darren turned, searching for Rinna. She was surrounded. 3 raiders circled her, weapons drawn. She fought fiercely, but she was outnumbered. Darren didn't think. He acted. He grabbed a loose rock and hurled it. The stone struck one of the raiders in the back of the head. The attacker stumbled, giving Rinna an opening. She didn't waste it. With a sharp twist, she drove her spear into the nearest enemy, then turned to the next. Darren ran forward, joining her side. They fought together, their movements in sync, human and alien. 2 warriors. 1 goal. Survive. The last raider hesitated. His allies were dead or fleeing. He looked at Darren, then Rinna. His grip on his weapon trembled. Then he ran. Silence followed. Only the wind remained. Darren let out a shaky breath. His body burned with exhaustion. His heart pounded. But they had won. Again. Darren leaned against the cave wall, staring at the snow-covered battlefield. Bodies lay motionless. Blood stained the white ground. Rinna sat beside him, her breathing steady. They won't come back, Darren muttered. Rinna nodded. No. Darren closed his eyes for a moment. It was over. He looked at Rinna. What now? She thought for a moment. Then she pointed at the horizon. Move. Darren frowned. Where? She smirked slightly. Somewhere warm. Darren chuckled, despite the pain in his ribs. Yeah, I'd like that. They had survived the cold, survived the raiders. And now, they would find a new home. Together. The frozen world had tested them, but it had not broken them. They were more than survivors now. They were warriors. They were free, and nothing would stop them.